The air screamed, but it wasn't from the men. It was the sound of metal, hot, fast, and final, tearing through morning fog like a thunderclap. Normandy, 1944. A battered German unit, pulling back under pressure, stumbles across a small clearing near the riverbank. Mud clings to their boots. Their commander shouts something none of them hear, not over the drones of overhead aircraft, not over the distant thump of artillery. Then it happens. A single gun erupts on the American line across the creek. It doesn't bark. It roars. The muzzle flash doesn't flicker. It pulses like a burst of lightning every half-second. One Wehrmacht soldier, barely 18, runs left. He takes 3 steps, maybe 4. What's left of him hits the ground before the echo fades. Not wounded, not down, gone. It's not just death. It's erasure. Chaotic shouts ripple through the German line. Amerikanisches schweres Maschinengewehr. They've heard rumors. Now they hear the reality. High-velocity shells slam into dirt, trees, bone, and steel without pause. Helmets shatter. Cover collapses. A full squad is pinned behind a tractor that's cut in 2 within seconds. The officer gives the retreat order, but no one's moving forward again. All they can do now is survive the next burst. Later, one bloodied soldier, pale, shaking, barely coherent, is captured by American forces downstream. When asked about what happened up north, he takes a long pause, then whispers, "It tore us in half. It was inhuman, like thunder from God." The Americans call it the M2 Browning 50 caliber heavy machine gun. But in this war, on this day, it wasn't a name, it was a sentence, a weapon that didn't just kill. It dismantled everything it touched. Before it ripped men apart in French fields, before it shattered eardrums in Italian hills, before German soldiers whispered prayers at the sound of its distinctive thunder, the American M2 50 caliber machine gun was born from a different idea entirely. Stop planes, not people. The year was 1918. World War I had choked the skies with new monsters, armored German aircraft that shrugged off rifle fire and small-caliber machine guns. Pilots had begun to cloak their cockpits with steel plates. It wasn't fear. It was evolution. The U.S. military needed something bigger, meaner, final. They turned to one man, John Moses Browning. The name even now feels like thunder in military circles. He had already given them the M1911 pistol and the Bar automatic rifle. But what they asked of him now wasn't just innovation. It was impossibility. Design a machine gun that could fire bullets heavier than a man's thumb, fire them faster than a man could, think and survive punishment, not from soldiers but from the sky itself. Browning didn't flinch. He constructed a monster, water-cooled, belt-fed, high-velocity beast that could send 50 caliber rounds, each weighing nearly 50 grams, thousands of feet skyward with absolute consistency. It could chew through engine blocks, tear wings from wing bones, and punch a hole through armor plating at 2,000 to 500 feet. By 1921, the prototype was perfected. The Army called it the Browning M1921. The world would later come to fear its evolution. The M2HB, heavy barrel. Heavy was not a metaphor. Empty. It weighed nearly 84 pounds. Set up with tripod and vehicle mount, closer to 150. It took a grown man and then some just to move it on foot. It was never designed to be personal. It was a stationary defense system, a wing-mounted aircraft weapon, a tank-top killer of steel machines moving at 200 miles per hour. War changed that. By World War II, American troops were carrying the M2 far beyond airstrips and runway bunkers. They mounted it on jeeps, welded it to Sherman turrets, stripped its water cooling, lightened its barrels, and started improvising. Enemy. Supply trucks turned into smoking tombs with a single burst. Field. Radios exploded into clouds of glass, steel. Helmets became paper when the 50 cal spoke. Commanders noticed something terrifying. This gun didn't just stop vehicles, it stopped waves of soldiers. Stopped charges. Stopped courage. Some officers hesitated. There were rumors that it was too powerful, that it wasn't meant for flesh, but war doesn't care what a weapon was meant for, only what it does when unleashed. And the M2? It did everything. Once intended to face fire-glinting wings in the sky, it now faced men on foot. It was never meant for the infantry. But the infantry used it anyway, because the only thing crueler than a 50 caliber machine gun was needing one and not having it. North Africa, 1942. The sand stung like razors, visibility was low, and the American infantry was still green. General Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps had torn through half the continent like a sharpened blade through paper. Their tactics were clean, efficient, fast. Their machine guns, the MG-34 and its beastlier successor, the MG-42, were the fastest in the world, almost twice the rate of fire of anything the Americans carried. They thought it would be an easy match, until their armor columns reached the outskirts near Kasserine Pass and started losing trucks to single shots. German forward scouts radioed back, "We are taking fire from large-caliber anti-tank positions." Projectile exit holes on transports. Oversized, upward trajectory. Total penetration. These weren't artillery. They weren't mines. They were belt-fed, direct fire. American mounting guns, and they were pulverizing everything over open ground. German commanders first assumed it was a coincidence, an ambush with heavier tank support. But in battle after battle, they noticed a terrifying pattern. The sound was slower than the MG-42, but deeper, thunderous. The recoil waves cracked across the landscape like mortar blasts. Trees didn't fall. They exploded into splinters. Troop morale, once unmoved by standard firefights, started to break before contact. By the time the U.S. landed in Italy in 1943, the 50 cal had earned a new name among Wehrmacht troops, Die Fleischsäge, the meat saw. At Salerno, a German motorized infantry unit crossed into what they thought was a poorly defended sector. Radio intercepts confirmed their plan. Light resistance expected. Push through the orchard and flank the artillery positions, but they never made it past the orchard. The first Jeep-mounted M2 opened fire at 800 meters. By the time the last trigger pull came, 14 men were on the ground, and a small delivery truck had been completely halved at the engine block. The ambush team never needed to reposition. When German officers recovered the bodies, they assumed an airstrike had occurred. But there was no cratering, no aerial shells, just pieces. In the months that followed, Wehrmacht field reports began referencing a new type of American machine gun, but they didn't know its name. They didn't know it had been around since World War I. All they knew was how it felt when it fired. Its range exceeds our MGs by hundreds of meters. Our men cannot return effective fire. Armor gaps in our lead vehicles are being hit precisely at distance. We request tactical changes. Do not expose gaps within 1,500 meters of American support positions. This was no longer about caliber. It was about psychology. German MG units knew they could outshoot the M1919. But the 50 cal changed the game. It didn't just challenge their small arms, it challenged their doctrine. By late 1943, panzer divisions operating in Italy began, shifting assault patterns purely to avoid high-ground American foxholes. Outfitted with mounted 50s, it wasn't that it stopped their tanks. That was the job of bazookas or 76 mm shells, but it stopped everything else leading up to the tank. It burned fuel trucks. It disabled mortars before first launch. It killed lieutenants before they could move squads forward. And worst of all, it was never alone, because behind every M2 was a soldier who knew all he had to do was open up, and the entire battle could change. A former German infantry captain, years later during a post-war interview, recalled that sound from the hills near Monte Cassino. Ours was the rapid stream, like sewing thread, fast, cold, logical, but theirs was rage. It shook your ribs. It was like God had picked up a typewriter and started smashing it against stone. The MG-42 may have had the speed, but the .50 caliber had something more powerful: fear. It wasn't a machine gun, it was a moral destroyer. Belgium, January 1945. The snow was thick, mixing with smoke in the air. A quiet fog of war that touched everything in gray. Corporal Eddie Monroe's hands were numb. He couldn't feel the trigger finger that had already killed 2 men in the past hour. His squad, what was left of it, held a makeshift trench at the edge of a stone bridge outside a village no one could pronounce. Correctly, the German offensive was coming. Everyone knew it. And they were low on everything. Rifle ammo was pooled together. 1 bar had already jammed from ice. 2 men were dragging ruptured sandbags with bootlaces, trying to buy 30 more seconds of life for the one still breathing. Of the original 17-man squad, only 9 were left still firing. Across the gray horizon, armor rumbled, infantry silhouettes appeared, dark figures in motion cutting through the white. Monroe glanced at Tech Sergeant David Price, 34, crow's feet under hard eyes, the kind of man who could swear while praying and still be convincing at both. Price wasn't shooting. He was assembling something heavy, something built of chrome, dirt, and purpose. And then Monroe saw it. That unmistakable squared side, the side plate engraved with 7 digits and decades of legacy. The M2 Browning. The Ma Deuce. Price slid the tripod into place on the edge of the trench wall. Ice cracked under his boots as he locked the feed tray, balled his fist, and dropped in the first linked belt of shining brass .50 caliber rounds. No ceremony, just a low mutter. Let's show 'em what thunder sounds like. In the distance, the first MG-42 barked. American rifles began replying, but it was scattered, staggered, pushing bullets into a blizzard. Then Price grabbed the butterfly triggers. In slow motion, the M2 came alive. The bolt slammed forward with a brutal clack. Gas hissed through the cooling holes. Brass exploded from the side, streaking through the air hot enough to burn flesh mid-flight, and the sound. The sound was no longer a machine gun. It was a thunderclap with rhythm, a war god on percussion, a steel-throated scream that rattled helmets and cracked frozen skulls from 600 yards out. Everything changed within 10 seconds. The German infantry line, confident a moment earlier, dropped behind rocks and trees that disintegrated under the heavy rounds. A half-track's windshield burst inward, shredding the machine gunner behind it. Tank treads skidded to a halt, not from impact, but from fear. Even steel hesitated. Shells pinged through the undercarriages of trucks, igniting fuel. A bunker wall began to crumble, ruptured by repeated hits targeting the same stone slab with clockwork fury. Monroe, ducked beside Price, shook his head later trying to describe what he saw. It didn't just shoot. It screamed. It rattled, shook, and ended everything it touched. The line was held by a single weapon, held by its roar, its bite, its wheel-spinning beast breath, but mostly held by one man unwilling to let it go even as enemy artillery closed. Price kept firing long past the withdrawal order. His shoulders bled where the recoil hammered through the buttstock, but that gun was alive now, and it wasn't done talking. When the dust settled, The Americans had not only held the bridge, they had won. Not by numbers, not by strategy, but by letting the monster breathe just long enough to change the story. Medics evacuated Price 3 hours later. He had a fractured collarbone, 2 cracked ribs, blood loss, ruptured eardrums, and a grin. "Ma Deuce did all the talking," he said. "I just held on." His M2 had cooked the barrel by day's end, but even in failure it was loyal. It wasn't a gun. It was refusal made mechanical. It was rage, channeled through steel. A last stand, with no poetry except the smoke rising from its muzzle after action reports logged unexpectedly effective suppression. The Bronze Star came months later, but Price said he didn't care about the medals. The only thing that survived with us that day was the gun. That bridge never fell, because when the breaking point came, one man and one machine decided they weren't going to break with it. Italy, 1944. The fighting had rolled straight through the hills like thunder. The orchard was supposed to be a checkpoint, nothing more than ripe oranges and visibility. Instead, it became a trap. A 12-man American recon unit, cut off, low on rations, lower on ammo, lay pinned against a half-dug irrigation ditch somewhere outside Anzio. Above them, a trio of MG-42s barked nonstop from opposing ridgelines. Crossing fire in a lethal X, leaves didn't fall. They evaporated in bursts of supersonic lead. Every time someone lifted their rifle to return fire, it was met with absolute suppression. Their bar had been cracked in two by a mortar shard. Their radio was dead. Reinforcements weren't coming. Corpsman Stanton, clutching the bandaged arm of a panicked private, muttered, "This orchard's a goddamn coffin." And then someone moved. Not to run, to change it. Private Ray, scratch. DeMarco wasn't the strongest, not the bravest, but 2 months earlier, he'd helped salvage a vehicle turret from a wrecked half-track north of Salerno, and inside the twisted frame, covered in sand and carbon soot, dripping oil like blood, sat an old, battered Browning, M2, no mount, no tripod, just her. They'd slapped her into the back of a flatbed, just in case. And this moment, was the case. Ray rolled out from the ditch without saying a word. He sprinted, hunched, dragging the M2 by her side handles like she weighed as much as a man. The fire intensified, trees stripped behind him, apples torn from branches by grazing rounds. One enemy bullet clipped his helmet. Another pinged off the casing. He didn't flinch. He reached a scrubbed-out high point, half a vineyard mound, half a burial mound. Then he began feeding the belt. No spotter, no loader, no brace, just him. And the gun. The M2 yawned once, then roared alive. Its voice cracked across the orchard like judgment. The loaderless setup shuddered so hard it nearly knocked Ray flat, but he planted his legs wide, locked the barrel with both hands, and leaned into its fury. He fired high first, into tree cover. 2 machine gun nests went silent. Splinters flew. A helmet spiraled down like a leaf. He adjusted the angle, began chewing through dirt and rocks near muzzle flashes. One entire section collapsed under falling debris, kicked up by the 50's wrath. His vision blurred. Oil misted into his eyes. His face blackened with carbon soot. He kept firing. His uniform caught sparks from ejected casings, neck blistering, knuckles scraped raw on overheated grips. He kept firing. Another position returned fire. He ducked, rose again, and poured 20 more rounds into the last viable cover. And then, silence. No return. No reply. Only ash, metal, and the stunned stillness of a battlefield rebalanced. Below, in the ditch, stunned Americans emerged like ghosts from a grave. Private Nelson whispered, "We thought Ray died in that smoke, but instead, He stood. The M2 slumped, barrel glowing, feed tray warped at the clip. He fell to one knee, finally, but not before raising one blackened fist to let them know it was done. Days later, in the pack of a slain Wehrmacht officer recovered from the tree line, American intelligence found a scorched leather journal. One page read simply, "We thought artillery had arrived. We now know it was one man with one weapon." The orchard never made it into the papers. There was no medal for Ray, but everyone in that unit knew what happened. 12 men went in. 12 came out, because one of them decided. The M2 wasn't just a gun, it was the only language the enemy respected. June 6, 1944. Normandy, Omaha Beach. By 700 hours, the Atlantic tide was already washing over the dead. Incoming mortar shells shattered the surf with white-hot thunder. Sand flew like bullets. Actual bullets tore men apart before they even made it off the Higgins boats. Some drowned still strapped to their packs. Others cried out for medics already bleeding out beside them. It wasn't a landing. It was a graveyard being filled in real time. And at the heart of it was Private First Class Walter Hayes, 24 years old, Flint, Michigan machine gunner. Section B carried not just ammo, but the storm itself. Walter's M2 had barely made it ashore. It wasn't mounted. No turret, no tripod. The boat had been hit before they could offload it properly, and Hayes had hauled it the rest of the way himself, choking in seawater, slipping in blood, back and legs screaming with every movement. He dropped behind the twisted corpse of a Czech hedgehog, sand spilling into his barrel grooves, belt soaked, gloves gone. Feet beside him, 2 medics were trying to stop a chest wound that wouldn't close. And just beyond them, a cluster of infantrymen caught in the open, pinned by an MG-42 pouring hell from a concrete nest above the bluff. Walter didn't think. There was no grand decision. Only the instinct of a man who knew what the M2 could do when it wasn't being questioned. He fed the belt, slammed palm to charging handle, and raised his weapon. The 50 cal opened up like it was angry to have waited. At once, the beach changed. German fire paused, just for a moment, unsure of the new tone in the battlefield symphony of death, because this sound was different. Louder, deeper, final, tracer. Rounds lit the air like God's own lightning, slicing through camouflage netting, obliterating anything that resembled cover. The MG nest flinched, then burst apart as if the ocean itself had risen and turned to steel. Walter shifted targets. Another burst up left toward a cluster of helmeted heads, gone in seconds. Then right, suppressing fire near a bunker entrance, bullets ricocheting violently, forcing the Germans further back inside. Behind him, the pinned Americans began to move. Their window had opened because Walter had refused to stop pulling the trigger. Then came the first hit. A 9mm round, lucky shot, grazed his rib. He didn't feel it. The second hit his thigh. That one, he noticed, only because his boot filled with warm blood faster than the tide rising around him. Still, he fired. He kept firing. The weapon jerked violently now, belt links biting against his raw knuckles. Smoke seared his cheeks. The roar had already stolen his. Hearing, all he could sense was vibration, and light and pain. Another. Round grazed his shoulder. He dropped to his knees, used the weight of his body just to keep the barrel steady. He kept firing. Runner crawled up beside him to help swap belts, but Walter shook him off. "Get those boys up the hill," he grunted. "I'll hold the line." Barrages thundered, but he didn't flinch. The gun didn't jam, and so neither did he. Minutes more, or maybe seconds, no one could say. And Walter finally slid forward slightly. The belt ran dry. The barrel hissed violently, twisting with heat. and Frat Walter Hayes slumped onto the M2's feed tray, hands still clenched around the butterfly. Triggers. That's how they found him. Not curled in. Fear not crawling away, but draped over the same weapon he brought to life with his own breath and blood. They had to pry his fingers away to clear the gun. By that time, his platoon had breached the bunkers. The wounded were still alive, because Hayes had given them seconds they should never have had. One soldier later wrote in his journal, "He didn't just fire a machine gun, he became it, his heartbeat in 50 cal." Walter Hayes was buried 3 days later, overlooking the same bluff he had emptied into, with relentless defiance. For weeks, his name didn't appear in the briefings or the citations. There were too many dead to process, but the squad remembered. They told his story first, not the general's, not the strategy. His. Because in the end, one man, one battered M2, had rewritten that moment on Omaha. Not with medals, but with fire, and he never let go. The gunner who wouldn't let go. Not a myth, not a legend, no statue, just a man with bloody hands and the will to use them, until his last breath. Years after the last bullet was fired, after Normandy's shores quieted, after the last tank tracks had vanished from Belgian snow, the fear remained. Not on the battlefield, but in the memories of the men who had tried, and failed, to face America's most brutal battlefield instrument. Not a tank, not a bomber, not a strategy, a gun. It began during POW interrogations in late 1945. Allied intelligence officers, running post-surrender debriefs of Wehrmacht officers, quietly noticed something odd. Whenever weaponry was discussed, those from the German side spent more time talking about the Browning .50 caliber than any other U.S. weapon, including the Sherman tank. One Luftwaffe pilot caught near Munich lowered his voice when the M2 was mentioned. "We called it das Donner-Orgel," he whispered. The thunder organ. Why? Because when it started, there was no harmony left in us, only the vibration in our bones telling us to get down and never come back up. Infantry units from the Africa Corps confirmed it. Veterans from the Italian campaign discussed how they began to avoid visibly mounted jeeps, even before they were in range. One said simply, "The vehicle didn't matter, the weapon did." A Waffen-SS lieutenant, archival tape now housed in the Bundesarchiv, gave one of the clearest confessions. When the 50 started, your training left you. It wasn't like our MG-42. That was controllable, predictable. There was something primitive about the American one. It erased men. It made our position irrelevant. Across the continent, reports confirm it. By 1944, German armored divisions openly avoided direct angles against U.S. units suspected of having M2 support. One directive, decrypted by British codebreakers and classified until the 70s, read, "Contact with American heavy guns results in unsustainable loss. Do not cross exposed zones without suppressive fire or alternative route. Enemy heavy machine gun is of caliber and penetration power to disable soft skin at over 1,000 meters." This wasn't a battlefield adjustment. It was an emotional concession. Even more revealing, Allied analysts noted that German commanders, during planning exercises, began assigning more weight to the presence of a Browning M2 than to 30 cal rifle squads or light artillery. One intelligence memo dated November 1944 suggests, "Enemy perception of American firepower is increasingly shaped not by our largest assets, but by the psychological and physical devastation of the M2 HMG. Post-war veterans brought it home with them, not just in their memories, but in their doctrine. The American military, in years following the war, didn't need fanfare to keep the M2 in service, because they'd already seen what it did to the hearts of those who faced it. When the Cold War began, and battle lines shifted from the fields of Europe to the jungles of Korea and later Vietnam, the Browning 50 came too, unchanged. Why change what already made your enemies flinch before your name left your lips? It became more than a weapon. It was the voice of U.S. force projection. From Korea's frozen rivers to Iraqi deserts, when American convoys rolled, it wasn't the Humvee or the helmet that sent the first message. It was the silhouette of a mounted beast, waiting, silent, loaded. The Brownings were back, and anyone who had fought them before or studied the archives of those who had already understood. You didn't win firefights against the M2. You survived them if you were lucky. Some weapons end battles. The M2 ended beliefs. It shattered the myth of Wehrmacht invincibility, turned mobility against itself, and replaced offensive conviction with caution, hesitation, retreat. That's how wars are won. Not just through victory, but through planting doubt deep enough to survive every ceasefire. Even today, historians argue whether the M2 merely supported victory, or became its own frontline strategy. Because any weapon can be built. But fear? Fear must be earned. 100 years. That's how long the Browning M250 caliber has been destroying targets, tipping battles, and planting fear deeper than any doctrine ever could. Ask a soldier today. Not one from Normandy or Anzio, but from Kandahar or Fallujah. They'll tell you, the Ma-Deuce hasn't aged. It's just gotten meaner with memory. In a world of missiles and drones, airbursts and cyber warfare, it might seem strange that a machine gun born in the age of flintlock rifles and trench whispers would still be bolted to turrets and convoy rails. But it is. And not because there's nothing better, but because no one's built anything better. No nation, no engineer, no enemy has made a heavy machine gun more reliable, versatile, and respected in the field. It fires at nearly 3,000 feet per second, hits hard at distances that still embarrass most modern belt-fed guns, punches through cinder block, armor plating, engine blocks, and mythology, and it just keeps running. In snow, in sand, under fire, mid-storm, or upside down mounted on a helicopter sling in God knows where Afghanistan. One Special Forces operator deployed in Helmand Province described it simply. We don't need to aim, we just announce. The M2 clears the area before the infantry even steps out, makes them scatter like ghosts. Old Taliban commanders recognized it just from its fire signature. They'd pull back without needing to see a barrel. Their foot soldiers were superstitious. They believed the Americans had some new weapon from hell, but it wasn't new. It was just John Browning's ghost still at work. It towers above modern tech because its simplicity is its strength. No fragile electronics to hack, no batteries to die, no GPS signals to jam, just steel, brass, heat, and hate, powered by the hands of whoever decides that. Retreat is not an option. Countries have tried to copy it. Russians built imitators, even NATO allies explored alternatives. But no replica has endured like the original. The U.S. military still uses the very same action Browning designed on a sheet of hand-drawn plans in the 1910s, still uses the same 50 BMG round, still gives the same psychological payload every time it rattles across valleys foreign and familiar. And it's not just firepower. The M2 became a symbol, mounted on tanks, boats, and Black Hawks, etched into movies, memory, and headlines. It sits atop embassy defenses, serves as the last guardian of foreign bases. And when dignitaries roll through a danger zone, it's an M2 watching from the rooftop that whispers to would-be attackers, not today, 100 years. Countless enemies, zero replacements, because you don't replace this kind of weapon, you inherit it. You teach it to young soldiers, the same way you'd pass down legend or doctrine. Its name doesn't just belong in a field manual anymore. It belongs in myth, a piece of metal that aged into immortality, fired by men, trusted by ghosts, remembered by everyone. This isn't about the past, not anymore. This is about how one man's mind, John Moses Browning, birthed a creation so complete, it didn't need to be perfected, just respected. A design meant to bring down aircraft, now standing as the backbone of battlefield denial a century later. No memorial was needed. The gun itself was the memorial, and it still speaks with the same voice. Because steel doesn't forget. This wasn't just a gun, it was a message, a statement, a storm in steel. The Browning M2 50 caliber didn't evolve over time. It didn't change with the decades. Because it didn't need to. It was born complete, forged, as a final word in the middle of every firefight. A line drawn not in the sand, but in smoke, fire, and bone. The M2 didn't just kill. It convinced. It bent enemy morale. It dictated movement. It rewrote tactics across oceans and eras. And in doing so, it taught a deeper lesson. One not about bullets, but about belief. If a machine could shape morale, if a weapon could speak so loudly it reprogrammed fear itself, if a design from 100 years ago still makes enemies turn around, then we must ask, what else are we underestimating today? What ideas? What tools? What truths are we ignoring now just because they feel too heavy to carry? This story wasn't just about firepower. It was about men who lifted the weight anyway, because someone had to hold the line, and someone had to keep holding the trigger, even when the whole world tried to run. Subscribe to War II Diaries for more stories of the tools, tactics, and terrors that shaped World War II and still haunt strategy today.